The next source of the law is treaties. What are treaties? Well, a treaty is a legally binding agreement between two or more nations. Now, there are different types of treaties, and they can be categorized in different ways. Probably the most common is what's called a bilateral treaty, meaning that's a treaty between two countries. The opposite of that is what's called a multilateral treaty. A multilateral treaty is a treaty involving a large number of signatory nations. And in fact, in the largest multilateral treaties, the treaty is available to anyone. It's not specifically negotiated between any two, any three, any five states. Instead, the treaty is reached and anyone is eligible to sign it, any country. Now, treaties under the law are governed by, guess what? A treaty. So it is a treaty that establishes the international law of treaties. And that's the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. It's a treaty about treaties. And this Vienna Convention sets out what makes a valid treaty or not. We're not going to study the particulars of it, but I thought it was interesting that when it comes time to look at what is the law that governs treaties, it's a treaty. Now, treaties can be classified in other ways. Treaties can be classified as formal or informal. Formal would be the type of treaty that's in the majority and the type we're aware of, in which a negotiated agreement is reached and then signed with great fanfare and pomp and circumstances. However, that's not necessary in order to make a valid treaty. In fact, even an oral agreement can be considered a treaty. Treaties can be, in a very informal sense, even a letter, a document, even a conversation could rise to the level of enforceable treaty. Treaties are often classified either as contractual or as lawmaking. Now, contractual treaty would be primarily bilateral agreements in which two nations decide between themselves certain things that apply to their own particular relationship. Maybe they're controlling access to a river or something along those lines. So a treaty can simply be contractual. Two parties set out the terms between themselves. A treaty could also be considered lawmaking, especially large multilateral treaties. The Convention on the Law of the Sea, for instance, that's not a contractual treaty. That's a treaty which sets out laws. And when a member country signs off on the treaty, when they ratify that treaty, then they become subject to those laws. So we can look at treaties as formal, informal, bilateral, multilateral, contractual, or lawmaking. There's one more category you should probably know. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but a treaty can be what's called self-executing, which means that the terms of the treaty become law in the domestic nation once that domestic nation has ratified the treaty, or the treaty can be implemented by national legislation, meaning the terms of the treaty do not become domestic law until such time as the national legislature agrees and creates a law implementing the treaty. Now, this is a tough concept, and actually we're not going to study it here. We'll study it much more when we get to the treaties that govern the European Union, but I do want to introduce it at this point. Now, where does a treaty come from? Well, a treaty comes into existence through stages. There are several stages of treaty. The first step in treaty creation is negotiation. Two or more parties sit down and negotiate an agreement in which they set out their terms, their goals, their hopes, their aspirations, the means of enforcing the treaty. That's the first step in treaty creation, negotiation. Now the second step is signature. You may think that's a little bit odd. Why are we signing a treaty prior to the final form of the treaty? Well, the signature stage is meant to indicate that the parties have agreed to agree, that the parties have reached the point where they're ready to put their final agreement into writing. So they will sign the treaty. The next phase will be ratification. Ratification refers to a state's full acceptance of a treaty. And ratification will generally occur after signature. Ratification by a state indicates that that state agrees to be bound by the terms of the treaty. However, that state may qualify its ratification. A state may sign a treaty, may ratify a treaty with reservations, meaning a state can agree to most aspects of the treaty while maintaining a reservation as to objectionable parts of the treaty. So a state may insist on reservations as it ratifies a treaty. And this is something that occurs often, is very normal and not unusual at all. The final phase of the treaty is entry into force. This is when the terms of the treaty become real, when the treaty is either self-executed, becomes a part of domestic law, or is implemented into domestic law by the national legislature. Now, the United States, you may be aware, has some special provisions on treaties. There's a difference in the United States between two different types of treaties. In the U.S., we have a treaty, which is a constitutional treaty, meaning a treaty that is described in the Constitution. And there's another treaty, and that's an executive agreement. An executive agreement is a treaty that the United States President can enter into, in large part based on his authority under the Constitution. So, what are the differences between the two? Well, a constitutional treaty cannot become a treaty without the advice and consent of the United States Senate. Now, this is a provision that's in the treaty, and the reasons for it, they're sort of historical. And the idea was the Senate would be a small contemplative body, and when the president had negotiated a treaty, the thought was he should bring that back to this small group of wise older men and get their advice, get their approval before entering into the treaty. Matter of fact, that's why the House of Representatives is specifically omitted from that part of the Constitution, because the idea of the House is big and unruly, and we don't want them involved with the ratification of treaties. Let's leave it to the small, older, wiser group known as the Senate. Now, there's another type of treaty power available to the president, and in recent years, American presidents have routinely used their ability to enter into executive agreements. Now, the executive agreement is international law, just like a treaty. It does not require the ratification by the United States Senate. It doesn't require that it be entered into with the advice of the United States Senate. It is binding international law on its own, because the Constitution gives to the president broad powers when it comes to the foreign policy. And the belief is the president has enough power to enter into those executive agreements without the need for congressional ratification. So both treaties, constitutional treaties, and treaties that are created by executive agreement, both are binding international law in the United States, which of course leads to confusion. People are often confused about the treaty-making process. They don't realize that most treaties over the last 2 decades have been the result of executive agreements.